Thank you. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. And I'll show you why you should know that the emergency exit is straight out, down the stairs. I'll get to that in a moment. This is probably one of the most difficult talks I've prepared for. And the reason is, it's kind of like doing a YouTube video. You don't know who, in a sense, you're going to talk to, and you're not sure where that is going to go. Oftentimes I'm asked to speak to CIOs or CEOs or boards of directors, and you kind of have a little bit of a sense of, what is that audience going to be. But this is a little different, and I'm very excited, and I thank Jill for the opportunity to do this, because as I'll talk about, I think it's a moment in time when leadership by both government influencers and corporations is at its most important time, and the actions we need to take are most severe. So I'll talk to that. As long as my slides change. So the career highlights you heard a little bit about, and I've spent my time in either technology or the financial services space, and a little bit of both. And in the early years, the work was with companies like HP or Next Computer, that was Steve Jobs' second company. Perot Systems, which was Ross Perot's company, and then later at companies like Nasdaq and Capital One. The early years were in what we call the sell side of technology, kind of innovating and creating the products for the buyers who are the ones I work for later. And just a couple of things example-wise, and my talk today is going to try and give perspective from where I stand. I'm not an economist, I'm not a policymaker. I'm just a guy who happened to be really lucky and do a lot of neat things in the technology space and the finance space, and have gained through my travels and through those experiences some interesting ways of looking at the world. And so I'm going to talk about some of those interesting backgrounds and then pull it into some of the notions I think we need to work toward. So Nasdaq, you can't really think of a more technical company than Nasdaq. The name of the company is based on a system. The National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotation System. That's what Nasdaq stands for. It's a system that was regulated to be in existence in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s, to compete with or provide another market for the New York Stock Exchange in the United States. It is one of the biggest, fastest markets on the planet, and I was there before the internet bubble until 9/11, until after 9/11, I should say. So pretty important time for that market, and a lot of growth. And I took it from the original system, which was a UNIVAC mainframe system, if you're familiar with technology, to a whole network of computing resources that surrounded one of the fastest, newest technologies at the time. And it was a place where you could not have any downtime. If the Nasdaq market goes down during the day, it's kind of on the news instantly. Seconds later, they're talking about Nasdaq is down. It's one of the very few places in the planet that you as the systems guy, the techie sitting behind this, you're on the hook. I went from there to Capital One. Capital One was the opposite end. Capital One's customer base is consumers. Nasdaq serves actually the corporate market. There's no real users that touch the actual Nasdaq market. They buy through traders. On the other side, Capital One, and I believe Capital One you may be familiar with here even, because in the UK, at least across the way, we had a huge marketplace. But it's one of the largest banks in the United States now. When I got there, it was actually a no-name credit card provider, and it became the 8th largest financial institution in the United States. And through this disaster, has been one of the most stable of the financial institutions, believe it or not. Huge marketing engine, billions of pieces of mail going out, hundreds of millions of calls with customers, and a diverse set of systems. Although, interestingly, a very resilient environment. You don't have to have the real-time backup nature of the Nasdaq stock market in this market. When you swipe your card, for instance, or when you dip your PIN and chip card, it does not instantly touch the marketplace of the bank. It actually goes through many intermediaries. So very different environment for me, but huge micro-market segmentation issues and huge amounts of data. But who am I really? And I talk to this because this is really where we form our ideals and our character. And I'm a geek. There's no doubt about it, and I don't have any issues to say, gosh, I've apologized for this. It is in fact one of the greatest things that I love to do is explore new technologies, find ways in which that can change people's lives. Obviously, for me, it's the leverage that it provides, not just the toys that you can have fun with. I come from a service mind. My father was a preacher. My sister was a social worker, or is a social worker. I'm a native Floridian. That's more of kind of, I'm from nowhere. There is no such thing as a native Floridian. Everybody is there from somewhere else, it seems. And I've lived my life kind of being from somewhere else, and you'll see that in a moment. And most importantly, I'm a father. I want to see the future for my kids to be something exciting, have lots of opportunity. They're from, my wife is born in Korea, so my kids are from an interracial family. And so they get a very different perspective than even I get. And they are seeing things that I couldn't have dreamed of. That's my daughter, by the way, that's Ariel there. And my son, that's a wild bird. It's actually in the rainforest of Nicaragua. Or actually, I think that's from Costa Rica. And that's my wife petting the little shark there. Not a great white, obviously. Another aspect by which we get perspective is where we've been and where we've lived. I was born in Chicago, Illinois, but I've lived across the US and in Europe. I've done business in most of Asia and Europe, and I've actually traveled to every one of the 50 states in the United States. Latin America. I haven't spent much time in sub-Saharan Africa, but even down here in Sydney and other places, and I haven't actually got the last continent, the Antarctica. Not sure I'm going to get that one anytime soon. But I spent a lot of time in a lot of places. And as was mentioned earlier, I've done some in disaster recovery. And my background dictated that, being a CIO, but it started at my own home in 1989 when we were literally just a few miles from the Loma Prieta quake. This was the 1989 San Francisco quake, people will call it, but we were right there where that nice red spot is. Lost the house to that one and moved to the UK. That was pretty important to me. But after the Loma Prieta quake, it just continued. And that's why I say the emergency exit is just down the way. But I've been through dozens, literally, of disasters, whether I was involved directly in the disaster, meaning a victim, or in recovery from that disaster. Floods in the Connecticut, a blizzard in DC. This is ground zero. This is the Nasdaq stock market right here. That's ground zero across the street. I was driving away from ground zero as the first plane hit in a car, luckily not in the building. But I spent the entire week in the recovery of the US markets, stranded literally there, while my wife was in a very safe place, Washington, DC, with my family. We kind of straddled both of the two kind of contact points for that disaster. You may not be familiar with the anthrax attacks of the DC sniper, but these were pretty big deals in DC. Isabel was a hurricane that came into inland Virginia. Who knows why, but we lost entire power for a week. Katrina, Rita, Wilma, Capital One decided to buy the largest bank in New Orleans the week that Katrina hit. And so I was actually down there the Friday before the Sunday that the hurricane hit, and spent literally months in recoveries there, airlifting our staff out of Tulane Street and trying to provide housing for 3,000 people that got affected in our workforce alone. And most recently, I've had to airlift my family out of Gangtok when we were doing some research up there, and a civil disobedience activity occurred, and we could not get out other than through helicopter. So, and this is, as I said, a short list of some of those activities, but it's amazing what that perspective will bring to you, because these are the moments, these situations of crisis are the moments when people rise and the true character of humanity comes through. In some cases, it can be negative. When we were airlifting that group of my staff out of the Tulane Street headquarters in New Orleans, they were shot at by ground forces, if you will, but by looters. At the same time, you see some amazing capabilities that people come to, their top performance or their most caring performance. I spend my time now out of the corporate world, in third world countries a lot, looking at sustainability, riverfront property in Bangalore. This is a beachfront community in Chennai, townhouse in the city, Bombay. But to be truthful and serious, looking at what is the plight of the other half or the other, several billion who need a different way of living and who we can provide for potentially a solution for in the next decade if we really put our minds to it. And the question is, what are the sustainability issues there? What does education bring? What are the approaches that are working? What are the approaches that aren't working? And my wife and I have chosen a field-based approach, so we spend 15 to 16 weeks out of the year in countries, in places, looking at what's going on. And we bring our kids most of the time and really visit and work. This year we'll be working in Nicaragua with the kids for 9 days, going off to Mexico in a community. So spending time actually seeing what's going on. This one, I don't know if anybody's seen the perspective that can bring, but does anyone see that what shouldn't belong in this picture? Go ahead, blurt it out. Most audiences are a little reluctant, but is there something in here that doesn't look like it belongs? The building in the back? Which one? The Taj Mahal. Yes, this, by the way, is a very interesting shot in that this is the first view of the Taj Mahal you will get if your taxi driver is taking you from the airport to the tourist zone. And it is, in fact, normally I say this is a study in water and waste management, telecommunications and electricity, better planning for housing. But in fact, this is an iconic image for me because it really talks to the dichotomy of our planet. Here is one of the ultimate icons of India, many, but this is one, certainly. And this is what surrounds it. This is the city of Agra. It is like this everywhere. And it's unbelievable, kind of the mix of these two things going on. So projects that try and take that and move that from, basically a house that's made from rubbish to a group of people working to create something that might have sustainability and length are the types of projects I'm looking at. And what does that mean? And the problem comes that when you look at these solutions, no single solution can scale to the billions. It doesn't matter how great Habitat for Humanity is, doesn't matter how vocal Bono is. These individual approaches, not any single one of them, and that's why perhaps there are, it seems, millions of these social efforts, but no single one of them can actually scale to the degree we need them to scale to make a difference fast. And so I come to policy and the notion that it is a time when, of all times in the history of humanity, policy and policy research and the influence of policy and policy research on government and corporations has its biggest lever that it's ever had. And I'll look back now on a little bit of time. And forgive me if my graphics don't work well. I'm not sure if you can see everything. And you don't necessarily have to see all of the data to understand the image. This is the history of population over the last, it says 2.5 million years, but it's actually kind of changes the scale at the bottom here. And if I, for the moment, will label Earth 1.0 as the period prior to 10,000 years ago. So around 10,000 years ago, Homo sapiens come into being, and we can say that that's a mark that we ought to think about relative to my humanistic or human-oriented view of Mother Earth or Earth as a planet. So prior to sapient beings coming onto the planet, Mother Nature pretty much ruled everything, right? There was not a whole lot of individual species changing the planet. And if I move forward here to the sapient now, this is from 10,000 years ago, around 8,000 BC, till just after the plague. You'll see on this rise, but just at the tipping point of population. I've marked this section the benign sapient. And Earth 2.0, if you will, is, again, negligible impact. At this time, the societies and communities are so distributed and so small that they still, although they're modifying the world, they're not modifying it in a way that is having a malignant effect, right, for the most part. And there's some minor areas where you can say, well, gosh, Didn't the Aztecs pretty much mow down parts of the rainforest in southern Yucatan? Well, yes, maybe they did. But on a whole, communities were not affecting across the globe until the Industrial Revolution. So here's this little red zone, compressed period if you look at it, and yet incredibly transitional for the planet. You've seen it in lots of maps about CO2 and other impacts. But here's the kind of malignant sapient or Earth 3.0 period where we didn't think a whole lot about what extraction of resources meant and what use of resources meant to the long-term trajectory of the planet. We just did it, and it was what fueled the population growth. It was what fueled the ability to have food, transportation, etc. So along with the view that I just painted earlier, which is no single effort can transform the way the planet is now heading, similarly, it is a time when we have to take a sustainable approach to the future. This Earth 4.0, in my mind, is we can no longer claim a non-awareness of the issues as we could in the Industrial Revolution. Who knew at that time that the Industrial Revolution was going to do what it did, right? You can claim all sorts of reasons for at least 100, maybe 300 years of total ignorance of where we were going. But for the last 60, 70 years, we have been building arguments about, and I don't mean just environmental, I'll talk to a few other impacts, but we've been building arguments to why the impact of technology population is detrimental. And this is Paul Ehrlich's paper from the 1960s, The Population Explosion. Whether you agree with his predictions, which were mostly wrong, about the fact that population would overtake us and we would be in no food, you have to recognize the impact of his equation, which is the notion that as you grow population, as you grow consumption practices around the population, if you don't affect the efficiency of use of those resources, you have an equation that blows out of whack, right? The impact, the environmental impact, the detrimental impact of that equation, if it's just let grow rampant on any of the variables, is going to be a problem. Clearly, I would argue that managing population has a huge effect. So if we could get ourselves to drive population as the #1 issue across the planet and figure out the ways to make that work without it going upside down, that might be as impactful. But these two, consumption and efficiency, are absolutely critical. And technology is a lever in that. And let me just use one example of a failure to adapt to this, which is carbon-based. The US population, 300 million, produces about 6 billion megatons of CO2 emissions. And if we look at this now from an Indian perspective, India has 1.1 billion people, and they produce approximately 1.2 billion metric tons in carbon CO2 emissions. What would happen if the Indians were to adopt the US practices, the consumption practices, the emissions practices? Well, we would have a pretty dramatic problem, because that would take our current situation up by nearly 20 billion metric tons. And oh, by the way, some wouldn't forecast that the Indians are the worst to worry about right now. Maybe the Chinese and the Russians and everybody else, the BRIC countries. So if we let this continue at the current consumption rates of the worst offender, the US, we have a huge problem. It's unrecoverable. And so it's incumbent upon the developed countries to find the solutions with technology for these issues, and incumbent to do it really quickly. We don't have much time. If you look at the polar ice cap, or just here in Dublin, this is a map of the potential rise in sea level for a 2-degree rise. And the darker red you are, the more wet you're going to be. And this is not a good thing to be if you're in Dublin, right? Which is where 50%, 30%, whatever of the population of Ireland lives. You're going to have a nice migration back and up. And oh, by the way, there's lots of other port cities here. This has been a land of coastal opportunity. So this is true across the world, though. And so I say the impacts are great. We only have 1% of water that's drinkable and fresh on the planet. Even though that big blue blob is mostly water, we have a very inaccessible supply of the actual water that we can use to drink and to water our agriculture. That's at risk. And if you look at this map, which is a 2025 view of water scarcity, anything below the equator is just ravaged in the next 25 years, given these directions. Economic issues. I won't go into the details of this one, but if you just want to look at this purely economic, the Stern report kind of gathers up all of the feedback and says, gosh, if these effects happen to our environment, what happens to business? What happens to countries? And, oh, by the way, there's been criticism of Stern's use of discount rates, et cetera, but the reality is that the environmental projections were way below what's already happened in the IPCC report. So it didn't matter that Stern was a little over-conservative or under-conservative. The environmental effects have already trumped it. So other things, swine flu. I mean, recent breakout. This is a global situation. You can't manage this based on any one activity or any one country, right? These require global responses, and global effects have to be managed. So I find myself, when I'm looking at the recovery from a recession such as we have right now, wanting to realize that you have to have both local and global actions. You have to have both individual aspirations and passions, like an NGO founded to deal with a specific issue, and policy and effective research that requires and pushes the public commentary to something different. And bringing it home to Ireland, the Celtic Tiger moniker from Kevin Gardner in '94, I think described a very interesting phenomenon that occurred here as both a global leader and an individual response to needs here in a specific country. And if you look at Ireland as a model, you've got, and these figures are within the last year. Some of them have changed though, so you could probably argue one of them or another one of them with different data today versus yesterday. But these are some of the rankings of the high points of Ireland as an example, a model for the planet. And the most notable is an exemplary return to prosperity from some pretty tough times. I mean, there's no economist that would not agree with that one line. All the others you can argue rank, or you can argue what is the definition exactly of a development index, human development index. But these are real numbers from UN or from other sources, and I have that in the back if you'd like it. But then we get this last comment, which is the one that people are troubled by, right? First in the EU to kind of officially declare a recession. Well, that could also be forward thinking, right? Just a little bit ahead of the pack. We didn't declare it in the US until we got rid of our president, but anyway. So is this a splinter in the tiger? Or is this something fundamental, that's wrong and cannot be removed? And I will say now that my assessment is that Ireland has the tenacity, the muscle, the brains to make the same transitions that have happened in the past happen yet again, with even more of a platform to stand on. And that these individual comments, while needing to be heeded, there's no doubt there's some truth behind some of them, I wouldn't paint doom and gloom. It's not exactly a party elsewhere. This is the financial data, and of course, we're looking at Ireland relative to others. But let me dive into this other country that I'm very familiar with, that's represented through this description of finance, which is the US and the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And if you look at this over the last 100 years instead of just the last 5, it doesn't look nearly as bad, right? and I've also, for the sake of clarity, this is a logarithmic scale here. So actually, this is 1,000 and this is 14,000. This would be way up to the roof, practically, if we really showed how dramatic the growth and expansion of the equities markets has been over the last 100 years. So any one issue seems maybe a little bit less daunting when you look at it this way. And let me just walk through a couple of the one issues. 1929, recession, depression, there's the crash. In 9/11, another notable recent mark. And then this is September of 2007, which is when the most current crash, if you will, is deemed to have started. One way of measuring recovery is, when does the market turn back positive? Some people think we've done it now, maybe already for the Dow Jones. But in 1932, only a few years later, is when the Depression came back. So if you measure it by that, maybe it's not that great a measure, right? This is another positive mark. This is 1982. And the market took a distinctly different slope. You know, we had this kind of section in the 40s and 30s, and then we have this great expansion. The expansion there can be attributed to a lot of things, but it is notable that we've got this run up to the age of irrational exuberance. That's what we called the dot-com bubble burst. But you can see as it changed, it went up and up and up, and then bam, you know, it took that little hit. And then here, 2003, only 2.5 years later from September 11th is when the market, again, turned positive. Let's look at it a different way, slightly different way, more in line with how the Depression really felt, which is it was a 90% reduction in market value from 340-something to $40 on the Dow Jones. And it was a 26-year period before it returned to the pre-market crash levels. That feels like a depression. that 90% drop and 26 years to get back to where we started, that's more than a generation. Those are real, you know, kind of tough times. And if you look at up here, I've drawn it very small, hard to see in this smaller screen, but you know, that's the time in which it took just a couple of years to get back from 9/11, a few years to get back from 9/11. And again, with logarithmic scale, this is about a 30% drop. So, you know, 28% drop, I want to point that out. And in the current market, this is about a 50% drop, and we don't know where it's going to hit yet, unless you take some Gregor simple mathematics and draw some lines. So, simple mathematics, which is draw some lines in PowerPoint. You know, not a lot of data here. Where's around the average before the crash? Well, gosh, it was above the age of irrational exuberance. Kind of interesting to note. And where's the average if you take the whole market of 100 years and kind of draw the line through that? Well, gosh, it goes right through this kind of reset in the Depression. And if you extended this up, it would say that around 2015, we'll be coming back. Again, no science here, not even a lot of math, maybe art if you want. But it's an interesting portrayal because I'll come back to this 2015 date a couple times. And it's kind of, you know, you could put a lot of science behind this and sometimes seat of the pants works just as well. But why does technology matter? We were here to talk about technology. Gregor hasn't, you know, spent half an hour maybe not talking about technology. Well, technology matters a whole lot because as you look at those graphs and you look at the time it took for recovery, what was going on? Well, let's look at three technologies here. Automobile, telephone, and electricity. All introduced in the late 1800s, kind of the dawn of the 1900s. And they all took, the graph shows the time and the percent of penetration of the US marketplace. So how long did something take to reach 70% penetration in the US marketplace? And if you look on here, it says that the automobile took approximately 100 years to reach 70% penetration. And the telephone kind of took somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's see, 70% right there, 80 years. And electricity took something around 55, 60 years. And by the way, you can see the Great Depression right there streaming through all of them as they kind of slow down for a little bit, and also World War II, so they're funding that instead of deploying electricity or telephone. And interestingly, down here, you've got some flatline characteristics of these technologies. They flatline in their adoption, so they're rolled out to just, you know, Edison Electric in New York for a while before the idea catches on and infrastructure catches on and they can move to other parts of the country. These technologies that ride on those technologies to some extent, like you can't have televisions without electricity, so they're introduced later. They're introduced in the 20s, 30s, 50s, you know, kind of after those other infrastructures are being laid out. You can start innovating on top of them. And they have this distinctly different feel to their slope. They all, for instance, now have this kind of curve. And while they get a little jittery up here, again, economic issues probably, if you looked in the macro map, you'd see what's going on there. But they have a dramatically different look and feel than these, which are actually kind of mountainous slopes versus these exponential slopes. And let's take this one further. The data in this chart kind of ends at 2000, actually, and I overlaid it with the iPhone. But here we have this elimination of two things. One, things are vertical. Once they get into the marketplace now, the infrastructures for transmission of that technology are pretty much there. And so this notion of having a flat line down at the bottom is virtually gone. And there's a couple of technologies here, like the internet itself, which stayed in a very controlled zone for a while before it finally was just exploding into the mass marketplace. And the other thing you have, which is probably the most important realization, is that when an introduction of technology happened in the 1800s or in the middle of the 1900s, it took more than one generation to come into full deployment. In fact, it took 4 or 5 generations in some cases. So if that technology needed wisdom applied to it, you had ancestors who knew that technology. Parents, friends, etc. You had teachers who were familiar, really familiar with that technology. And they had generations of that, 2, 3 generations perhaps before you who experienced that technology. If you're in this space here, you're talking iPhone, cell phone, there's no other experience base. These technologies come into the marketplace, their user interfaces, their way of interacting with the infrastructure underlying them, their use of technologies other than theirs, their use of energy. All of those things are being invented in the moment. That technology era, that technology generation creates that world. And in fact, if you look at the ones that are happening now, you'll find that those technologies are actually obsoleting within a generation. I'll come back to that in a second. So if we look at this map, I could make it even more complicated and overlay each one of these innovations inside of this space here in the soft underbelly of the US economy and show where infrastructures and then innovations, and infrastructures and innovation are riding on top of one another as these marketplaces, as FDR comes to space, as the space program comes online, as the US interstate system, the automobile interstate system comes online, etc. Technology, in fact, is the fuel in every one of those cases. It's one of the major fuels. There are other things going on, so I don't want to be geek-centric here. But there are clearly areas where you can see that the steep slopes of expansion of the technology, of the marketplace, is driven or fueled by the technologies that are happening. And it goes in kind of an interesting sequence. Infrastructure, innovation on top of infrastructure. Seems logical, but it is not always invested in as if that's the way it should happen. And you'd think more governments and more policymakers would go, if I want expansion of private enterprise, I had better have infrastructure. And they go hand in glove. There's no way it can happen otherwise. And the more I create opportunity for expansion in infrastructure, the more I'm obviously going to get expansion in the enterprise itself. One other point I want to make on this slide, which is that Vint Cerf, I know who's been here, and he was at MCI when he made this quote, commented in 1997 that only 3% of the world's population had access to a computer. This is only 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And that's an interesting comment around what is the potential for growth. While these look steep, and while we look like we're coming up against what's it called? The hypotenuse, I want to say, but it's not the hypotenuse. Asymptote. We're not at the asymptote. They're going to get steeper, and the penetration of the global marketplace is going to go even faster. It's unbelievable to think that, but it is absolutely the case. Look at the types of technologies that are almost frictionless in their deployment, whether it's Skype and Twitter, YouTube, Meebo I don't know if Meebo is a big player over here, but Meebo is the integrator of all IMs. It's the Uber IM. So you can have one identity and actually have multiple identities out beyond that, your AOL, your tweets, your et cetera. And start managing that frenetic life of being a Twitter tweet. Zipcar, I don't know if Zipcar has made their entree into the UK or into Ireland, but Zipcar is a very interesting combination of the physical means and the technology means coming together. What they do is they provide a loaned car basis, not a rental car, but they distribute cars around the United States on street corners. And you log on and check out one of those cars with a little card that allows you to electronically unlock that car when you go and get near it. And you deposit it back there. Their cleaning crews go out and clean the cars and bring, every once in a while. But you have a totally distributed business based on a technology model that enabled them to do it, and they're selling it to governments to reduce fleets where they have overage of fleet cars that don't get used the way they would have in the past, and they actually are going to issue the same technology to manage down government by 25% fleet. So I mention that one because it's an interesting combination of both physical and technology online, which is what most of the rest of these are. So where do we go from here? Well, let's look at one other aspect of this, which is the platforms are changing. While the quote in 97 from Vint implies that the world is going to explode in PCs and that's where we're going to need to have the investment, the actuality is that over 60% of the world has a cell phone now. And those are billions of people in places you would never expect to go and maybe don't ever want to go that have this platform that runs Java. It runs an application suite and it actually works. And I've seen medical monitoring applications for diabetes in sub-Saharan Africa that are built on a Nokia phone. And it's not an iPhone. It's typically a Nokia phone, a very low-cost phone, and yet it has the capability. And that is one of, if not the primary deployment vehicle we're going to see for explosion of some of these applications in the future. Let's look at what this means in the bits and bytes for a second and allow me to be a little bit overly geeky here. I'll give a primer here for what is a megabyte, because I always forget. A gigabyte, a terabyte. Most of us can get up there. Anybody know the next one? Petabyte. Come on. Exabyte. No, usually it ends at exabyte, so you're pretty good with exabyte. Zettabyte, and the last is a yottabyte. Yes, a yottabyte. Now, we who knew what a megabyte was 5 years ago? I mean, this was not something in the common lingo, but now we've got, extra minutes that we can get from the telephone company, so we all know about minutes, and we've got to buy our megabytes for our download speeds and for our cameras, so we know about megabytes. Well, if you have any megabytes of pictures, you're going to have a terabyte soon, so you're at home. And anybody who's had a terabyte in the office has got a petabyte of backup and recovery, et cetera. And so let's look at this a little bit from where does the data go? And this is a good example. I could have done Alexandria, the library. It's 200,000 scrolls, 20,000 works, a little bit of history. But let's look at the U.S. Library of Congress, one of the repositories of the knowledge of humankind. 130 million items, 530 miles of shelves, 12 million photos. But it's only 10 terabytes. Relative speaking, it's, all of us could have this in our house. And Google tries to make it happen. Let's look at where the problem is then. The problem isn't in that space. It's over here in the corporate world. Corporates average 1 petabyte in 2007. That's online storage, offline storage, and backup and recovery. And when you look at that, the Earth, this is going beyond the Fortune 1000, is up to, in 2010, 980 exabytes. We're at the zettabyte. We're actually at, and if you think of PEZY, P-E-Z-Y, we're at the Z, the zettabyte. We're actually going to burst through. And what is that? That, given my other numbers, that is 1 billion times the Library of Congress. I mean, this could go around the planet, many, many times. And it's doubling, if you look at the graph, every 2 years. So that amount of data is doubling every 2 years. And this estimate was in 2007 when Twitter wasn't on. Okay? There was no twittering, and twittering has suddenly taken something that was like, small. How many messages do you send a day? We now send more SMS messages a day than are the population of the planet. 6 billion messages is the, I always look at these things a little bit of, which data is correct, but that is the current estimate. We will, so this number might go through the roof. Who knows? The recession's going on and Twitter's there, so, who knows where we're going to land. But how does this, now we got this planet going amok in some respects. We've got policy and we've got the need for kind of influence and change. What is corporate world doing? Right now, the corporate world is hanging on tight as best they can. This is a Gartner study that happens every year in the beginning of the year to ask businesses, what are the most important things you're working on? And if you notice on this list, they're not working on products. They're not working on innovation. They're working on staying fit, as best they can to stay as lean and mean and maybe keep the customers they've got. And somewhere down the list, At the bottom of the list was this notion of, well, maybe we should create new products. And even worse, as a footnote, is that maybe innovation will come back in 2012. Now, if you think about it, that 2015 timeframe becomes, again, a little bit of a backdrop, because Gregor's science here says that in 2015, you better be back to normal. Well, you better have done something before 2015 to get there. So if you think about innovation in 2012, maybe you have a chance of 3 years later getting to that convergence of where we were before we started this crash. But this is a very interesting thing to just hover on. We aren't, if you're thinking innovation right now, this is a study that was done 2 months ago around American innovation, and actually many multinational companies participated in the survey. And their focus is around, can I stay away? Can I stay above the surface of the water here? So where does innovation come from in these times? And I think there's a number of examples here that you'll recognize. Hopefully everyone recognizes Tyndall. Tyndall was the thing I know that I think is most notable about Tyndall is he is the person who answers the question, why is the sky blue? He was the first scientist to actually put forth the message. Said, here's why the sky is blue. He studied optics, he studied light, and he is the father of optic fiber in the end for us. And so the internet, the entire internet, everything on the planet that you guys see as the existence of current information technology, Ireland invented. That was it. It's the infrastructure. So, but these are a lot of folks who had vision, passion, and some way to galvanize action. The fundamental thing that these innovators did was they galvanized action. I worked for several of these folks. I worked for Steve Jobs and Ross Perot, and I've worked a lot with Mr. Gates, not by choice. But he was on the other side of the table usually. Oprah. These folks had the amazing ability to not only see the future, but to get people to do extraordinary and perhaps illogical things to get us to that future. And they had the ability to pick and choose and sometimes experiment. Edison's famous experiment with hundreds of thousands of experiments and how many filaments to get to the light bulb. But they had that ability and the tenacity to kind of see it through. We won't always have innovators in every line of need, but we have had a significant number of them. And these folks give us the example of what it takes. The innovation we need now isn't always represented by a face. It isn't always represented by an easy visionary solution, the single way to do the iPhone or to transform telecommunications or the next way for restaurants. These infrastructures, and I'll run through them, they're where we need this innovation, right? These are kind of boring things when you really think about it. Electricity infrastructure, how more boring can I get? The electricity works and that's the way it goes. But to get people to actually move forward and innovate in these spaces is what I think is the policy agenda and the kind of innovation agenda of the planet. And we have to do it in a way that's Earth 4.0, kind of non-malignant. It has to be a way that thinks about the impact and thinks about how we can do it in a better, more sustainable way over time. So I would argue that there's an incredible explosion of things that need innovation. And some of them need science, and some of them just need technology. We don't need a whole lot of science to do the US GPS deployment as opposed to using radar for airplane management. Right now the US uses these antiquated radar systems, so does most of the planet by the way, as opposed to using GPS, which could take you from point to point, reduce emissions, reduce fuel usage of airplanes, all sorts of great benefits. It's all science that's been around for a long time. It's just, can we get it funded? Can we get it deployed? And the same thing is true for the smart grid on electricity or getting roads smarter. This is the Model S from Tesla, electric cars, one of many. Agriculture, my gosh, what we've done in agriculture has probably gone back 1,000 years, and we need to kind of look at the things that we've done in the past. Biomedicine or alternative energies, all sorts of areas where the technology, it's really a problem of technology more than it is of science. There are certainly some science areas here, like nanotechnologies, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But there's an awful lot of innovation that can occur in stuff that's not really hard. We know what the solutions are. It's all about getting it done. and moving on action. So let's talk about how that's changed. There's something I call the new collective. And the new collective is both about technology and about interaction. So the new collective in this particular platform has 52,000 applications running today. This is like more than most computer environments, right? You know, if you look at the list of applications for the Microsoft operating system, you probably have more than 52,000. I haven't actually calculated it. But 52,000 is an awful lot of applications for anybody deploying a new platform. Available in almost 90 languages, 40 installed today, 50 coming. 500,000 developers in 180 countries operating in this particular platform. Anybody have an idea what it is? 3.5 billion minutes spent using it each day. Fastest growing demographic is 35 and above. Anybody got an idea? No? Facebook. Closer to the source. Over 1 billion items exchanged each week, and this is old data, like 2 weeks, so it could be way off. 100 million users log on every day. Every single day. This is, you know, not like, oh, I've touched it. 200 million have IDs. That's a little bit less. And yes, it's Facebook. This is like 4 years old. You know, this is where that vertical reality is coming from. And what it's doing has a lot of implications. Application development, deployment of applications. How do you actually buy the application? And going to a store or researching it, that's not how those applications get deployed on Facebook. You get deployed by somebody linking you to someone else through an application or an interest that you're associated with. If you haven't played with this, it would behoove you to look at it. And let's look at the way this goes. I mean, this is something called all my faves. If you want to explore the internet in a different view and you haven't got, you know, a guide to show you all the cool and whizzy new sites, allmyfaves.com is a great one because it lists in every category the highest hit rate sites on the internet. And it's no politics, no advertising, it's just, you know, allmyfaves.com. And you can, and it's not just kids stuff either. I mean, it's, you know, from video. You know, how many of us know what LiveLeak is? It's the #2 rated video site on the planet right now. I have no clue what it does. I haven't even gone there. Hulu. You know what Hulu is? In the United States, that's ABC, NBC. That's them actually trying to battle with the other two incumbents in the front of them, YouTube and Google, which happen to be the same company, by the way. Anyway, so amazing transformation on the internet, which is being driven by this open source, open kind of computing platforms that are ubiquitous and have huge uptake on the source developer side, and communications and social groups that have now a new voice. And what I'll talk to in a second is how that new voice is exploring itself. Another of these platforms is the iPhone. And I talked to the iPhone. It's a little bit of an elitist model because it's a little expensive for the planet, but it can't be that elitist with 37 million devices in its first 2 years of deployment. I mean, it's unbelievable how real those numbers were. They forecasted 10 million iPhones. That's about what they did. They did 12, I think, now. This is iPhones and iTouch because the two are actually the same platform. And as you know, perhaps by the press, they hit their 1 billionth download in less than a year of existence of the App Store just last month. And the notion that is being created from both the Facebook apps and the widgets on the web and iPhone-like apps is something I call micro apps. Little apps that, like the cable world, in the old days of the cable television world, you kind of had a television channel. The idea was a television channel per topic. In the new world, you've got a television channel or an app per question. The question is, what is my glucose level? Or what is the right price for petrol in Dublin City? And literally, to that specific question, people are creating applications. And you can see thousands of them from kind of sophomore comedy stuff that are the hot hitters in the free category of iPhone to very high-end, you know, monitoring systems for security applications that cost $1,000. It's amazing. So very much, and again, this is in its first year. very much a revolution that's going on in the space of what I call micro apps. And for a dollar, or for whatever the pound to dollar ratio is in the UK, and here the euro, it's about $1, right? So similar rate. We're talking amazing downloads, amazing. I have over 100 apps on my iPhone, and I also used BlackBerry for many years, and can tell you the difference between both. So what other models, for Ireland specifically, if we look at some ideas, I've talked to a few of the folks in energy and competitiveness while I've been here, and I would really love to see more countries actually embrace something like a better place. And better place is the notion that you have to create an infrastructure for electrical vehicles in advance of kind of the deployment. You can't expect people to jump onto the deployment of electrical vehicles if there's not going to be a way to fill up and not a way to get from A to B. And so Agassi, who is the founder of Better Place, invented this concept of what are the infrastructures you need to actually be successful in deploying an electrical infrastructure for automobiles. And the primary approaches are forward-looking, or primary targets for deployment in the early stages are forward-looking countries that are somewhat isolated transportationally, who need, from energy resource perspective, to be forward-thinking about their energy dependence and independence, and who would embrace a new technology. Seems to me there's a Celtic tiger in there somewhere. And so I would be pushing to say, why aren't we in there? At least why aren't we embracing things that cities like Delhi have embraced, which is to have all of my cars be either CNG or hybrid in the city, for instance, which doesn't seem to be the case, at least now. So one of the kind of interesting new technology areas. Another one which I think is absolutely critical in this space is the notion that geeks have to be cool in the light of kids' choices of where they're going to go. And I don't mean they have to be cool, meaning, boy, you're going to have all these fan pages for geeks. You're not. But the notion that you create a compelling reason for kids to get excited about science and technology. And this example is this company called First, is from Cayman, the guy who created the Segway vehicle or transformation for transportation. He got excited by saying, I need to try and influence kids to be looking at science and technology as a way that they can make their future. And the idea of creating a competition came to mind, and a competition that was like a science fair, but on steroids. And so the science fair that they have, this is the first robotics competition. He creates a challenge every year for the kids in robotics to compete against one another, whether it's throwing a ball into a hoop or whether it's getting a ball or playing some game against each other as the robots do. But each year it's a different competition. Each year schools from across the country are encouraged to field teams. The teams are supported by corporations in the most part. And they compete at a national level now. And it's a phenomenal way to get kids to go, wow, this is cool stuff. I like to make things that break things. I like to make things that blow up things. I like to play with cars. All the reasons that they like to do, but put into a structure which encourages innovation in science and technology. And I don't know what mechanisms would equate or be analogous here, but these are kind of infrastructures that matter, and the path to get to that infrastructure from a skills and innovation perspective that matters. You've got to find some, and one would expect that would be a big leverage point. I won't go into the research agenda in detail because I think you've seen this. You guys, well, the IIEA, if you haven't seen it, produces incredible literature and research on the topics of where things should be going, and the question of what needs to be done is not the issue. That is so far from the issue. The issue, the real research agenda in my mind, is how to get scale, how to actually impart the impact that these things are supposed to be giving, and how to move the action forward. Because I see all of the notions of research being very similar. You look at the various papers coming out of universities, various papers coming out of foundations, and you kind of line them up on top of each other and you go, gosh, it seems like we knew this stuff like in the 1980s, or, wow, where's Rachel Carson on the environment, or didn't the IPCC start in, late 80s, early 90s? What have we been doing all that time? And the problem comes in these questions. How do you actually get the people to do it and the scale to actually take? And I would argue that these are just as important, especially in a time when the voices of authority are disappearing. I use newspaper as the example here, but the voices of authority on the planet are having a dramatic problem. It's the notion that anybody can be king of information on the internet, on the one side, and the reality that transparency is there for you to go grab if you want to. And so if you were the only source of information for people living in Miami, Florida, the Miami Herald in the past, that is no longer true for both of those reasons. I can go and create my own blog with almost no cost and start talking about cultural events in Miami, and I can expose transparency issues around the one reporter that is covering it myself, and I can go around that, change the world. But it means that the definition of the voice of authority is under attack. Who is the voice of authority? And how does one find a good voice of authority with, fact-checking? Boy, that's a tough one on the internet now. With professional experience, with a bit of context that they can set around that. And I think that more than ever again, that policy and research player in this space is really critical. If you're a politician, you have no idea who you should be paying attention to. Your constituency creates a voice of authority individually and blasts you with things. All of these little, individual interest groups blast you. And where do you go to get a good word, the kind of a truthful word around this? And it's a very difficult problem that's kind of perplexing many. And the question comes out in the end, who do we want to be? Bernie or Susan? We're going to have warts. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We're not going to fix this situation to be perfectly, transformative, beautiful. But if behind whatever warts we have, we can sing like a star, that would be really nice. And it's going to take work that will be in that order. And of course, Bernie, we have the potential to be a house of cards, to have all the success and all of these looks and feels of everything going the right way, and then that tipping point being one that we just can't come out of when it actually hits. So I would argue that that's the fundamental question. I'm not going to go through my summary. I can come back to that, but I think I've made my points. It's a lot about choices. Oxfam estimates that the U.S. and combined global stimulus packages for bailing out the banks on the planet right now is up to $8.4 trillion. That's more than $1,200 for every human being on the planet. Now, if you work in the third world, you realize that you're not going to give that to the first world. So you took, let's say, take half of the world off of it. Now you got $2,400 per every human being on the planet if we took the money that we just magically issued up for stimulus packages and applied it to the third world. I mean, that $2,400 is an amazing amount of money in the third world. It's an unbelievable amount of money. 3-4 times the annual. So you could just with that, if you did this, you could sustain the third world for 3-4 years just on that money. You wouldn't do that because you would leverage it. But unbelievable choices we make. I'll close on two quotes here. One, leadership is what we need, and it's about the character of that leadership, as Arnold Schwarzkopf, Norman Schwarzkopf says here. It's the strategy is important. There's no doubt. But the reality is it's about the character. It's about the ways in which we get things to be followed. People follow characters. They don't follow strategies in reality. And so how we present our concepts, how we are able to actually show the real compelling need for things has to do with the character of the argument, not necessarily just the strategy of the argument. And I believe that's also true it's most true in times of trial. And the Iroquois have a proverb which says, we must consider the impact of our every action on the next 7 generations. And it's kind of an interesting closing quote, because this is a quote from a long time ago, hundreds of years ago, and yet it's so obviously relevant now. And I would argue that if you ask someone in current world to say, let's look out 2 generations, they would find that troubling. If I got to look out 40 years for this plan, what's the impact in 40 years? But the impacts, as I showed earlier, it was thousands of years of benign, sapient existence. And then, in the matter of hundreds of years, that just went, into a totally different zone. And it, by the way, the forecast is for the population to continue in that equation that I talked to from Ehrlich to multiply. So it is a time when this is most important. And I close with one of my activities. My kids and I are going to Nicaragua again. We go to Nicaragua. We went to Nicaragua about a year and a half ago. And the work we do there is related to villages that are very, very low income, sub $1 a day type of villages. And the kids have zero friction for interaction. It's amazing. My kids come down and they're, at the time, I think they were 9 and 11. Now they're 10 and 13. And the first thing that happens is the kids get together and they begin their own, they don't even have to speak the same languages. And when we're in India, they're speaking Hindi, or up at the border countries, they're speaking different languages. And the kids instantly start to communicate and create ways to communicate. If they can't communicate, they create a game in which they communicate. And the childlike nature of the network that is kind of embracing, that happens in the moment in physical networks, is in fact what the internet is searching for in its communities out there now. It's amazing to think about, but the ability for you to interact without any criticism, without any language necessarily the same, maybe not even with a shared experience, but to instantly come together and to try and kind of get something from that, is one of the major kind of lever points now in the internet. And I would argue that the impacts you guys can have in your daily choices on kids like this, or on your own kids, or on the future of the planet, are really reliant on your understanding. Understanding where this interaction is going, where the technologies are going that lead those interactions, and how to kind of get your own company, or your own policy work, or your own academic work to embrace that. And with that, I will take questions. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.